So I went to go see two movies today. One of them was really good and the other one was kind of terrible. The good news is the movie Last Breath. It's a very, very good movie. There was really nothing to be disappointed by with it. Although there were a couple of minor notable issues, this is really an A minus movie. It's very good. The second movie was probably one of the worst movies I've ever seen in theaters. The Monkey, which, as you guys know, came out last week. I didn't get a chance to review it last week just because last week was a busy weekend. I turned 22, and the show times were just, they were weird and different from other movies on release. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my full review of Last Breath and then give just my brief thoughts on The Monkey at the very end. All right, so let's get into the preliminary hearing. So, Last Breath is based on a true story, so obviously the writers don't have too much of a burden to bear there, but even still, they develop the story very well for the big screen. I think it's a really sad reflection on modern Hollywood that a lot of the best movies that have come out recently have been movies based on reality or based on a true story. You know it's bad when your writers can't tell fiction better than actual reality. Like, for example, we got Arthur the King from last year, which was my ranked number 2 movie for the whole year. We had The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which I think was probably a little bit exaggerated just for comical purposes, but it was still pretty entertaining and funny. And Last Breath does not exaggerate at all. From what I could gather, it is frame for frame of what happened in real life. The movie stars Finn Cole, who's kind of new to me. I haven't personally seen him in anything. We got the beloved Woody Harrelson, who is in Zombieland and The Hunger Games, which we all know. And then we've got Simu Liu, who most people first recognize him from Shang-Chi, which was an awesome movie. But then he ended up doing the Barbie movie, which was very unfortunate. He was also in Arthur the King as well. How convenient. The movie's rated PG-13. It runs at about 93 minutes, which I'm starting to wonder if those movies that are under 100 minutes are actually more common than I had previously thought, but I don't know. And then we've got a budget of $23 million as of the making of this video. And then just a quick synopsis from IMDb. A true story that follows seasoned deep-sea divers as they battle the raging elements to rescue their crewmate trapped hundreds of feet below the ocean's surface. And now for the trailer. The trailer is on point. It does exactly what it needs to do. It focuses purely on setting the story up, and the thematics that the trailer uses works very well with that. Now, it wasn't anything super memorable like Spider-Man Homecoming or I always think of Ready Player One was a very memorable trailer, but like I said, it gets the job done. It got me excited to go see the movie. Alright, and now for the story. As always, this will be the one and only spoiler warning. If you guys want to see my final verdict spoiler free, skip to this time in the video. So right off the bat, we open with a few shots of the bottom of the ocean. We get a few title cards talking about sustainer divers and how their job is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. This, along with the ominous music, just sets the tone very, very well for this movie. It sets up a very intense feeling of intimidation by the deep, dark sea. Then we're introduced to our main character, Chris Lemons, who is kind of new to this part of the job, specifically diving. He's pretty young, he's newly engaged, and his fiance is obviously very nervous about this job just because, like I said, it's one of the most dangerous ones in the world. These divers, they basically have a pilot schedule where they're working for a full month and then the next month they're just off and then back to it again. Then we're introduced to Duncan Alcock and Dave Uasa. Duncan is more of a veteran diver. He's been doing the job for many years and he's kind of coming up on his last days in that line of work. Dave is a bit younger, but he's still very highly seasoned and he's kind of looked upon as like a legend in their community. So the way these missions work is we have a mothership that travels from the mainland out to the deep sea wherever the work site is. And the best way to compare this is probably to the Apollo moon missions, where if we pretend that the mothership is the Earth and the work site at the bottom of the ocean is the moon, you have the ship with all the crew and the divers. They come down in this little capsule called the Bell, or in this comparison, we could compare it to the spaceship or the command module for the Apollo missions. It's got 3 divers on it. They come down, but not all the way down. they come to around 50 to 100 feet above the floor of the ocean. And while one diver stays in the Bell, two of the divers go down to the work site. So just like Apollo, where one astronaut stays in the Bell, or well, the command module, and then the two astronauts go to the lunar surface. So I thought that was kind of a cool comparison. So the ship sets off, and in the meantime, the divers have to spend a few days inside of this very large tank or capsule or whatever you want to call it, where it's just basically compressing the atmosphere on their bodies, just getting them ready for what it's going to be like at the bottom of the ocean. Since it's very deep down, the water's going to be compressing on your body. And eventually, after those few days, they're ready to head into the Bell to descend down to the bottom of the ocean. Now, the job of the sustainer divers is basically that there's 20,000 miles of pipelines that run on the ocean floor, and it's their job to basically maintain them. So whenever one breaks or it just needs maintenance, they do these missions, go down, do their maintenance for a few days, and then go back up. So from the mothership, the Bell begins to descend to about 50 to 100 feet above the sea floor, which in this case was approximately 300 feet below sea level. Chris and Dave equip their oxygen helmets, and they get connected to their umbilical cords, which, among other things, provides mainly oxygen to their suits. And then finally, they jump off the Bell and descend all the way to the floor. So for this mission, they're basically working on this large fluid mechanic manifold structure that's at the bottom of the ocean. They weren't very specific about what their mission was, but it seemed like it was to restore power to it. So while the guys are working on the manifold, the ship is actually using its thrusters to keep itself in place. Otherwise, the currents of the ocean would cause the ship to drift. And if the ship drifted, it would tug on the Bell and the two divers. We don't want that, so the ship's using its thrusters to keep itself in the same place. But the ship starts experiencing some issues, and then they lose all thrusters. Now the divers are obviously in really big trouble. They're now at risk of getting their umbilical cords caught and tangled on the manifold. So what they need to do is climb to the top of the manifold so that they can be safe from that. But on his way up, Chris accidentally preemptively gets his umbilical cord caught on a piece of hardware that's connected to the manifold. So that's not good. Now, the ship has managed to drift so far at this point that it's tugging both the Bell and the divers, but because Chris is caught on this manifold, his body is basically acting as an anchor for this entire ship. Chris's oxygen supply cord snaps, and so he starts to struggle to breathe. Dave turns on his bailouts, which is basically his oxygen reserves. Then it becomes clear that the rest of Chris's cord is going to snap too. So Dave basically promises that I'm going to come back for you, but you're going to get thrown off the manifold when it snaps. So what I need you to do is find your way back to the manifold, climb back to the top so that we know where you're going to be and we can find you. Chris's cord finally snaps off. He gets thrown away from the manifold, and the ship begins to drift again, dragging both Dave and the Bell with it. So basically, the reserve oxygen in their suits only lasts for about 10 minutes. So Chris is in a terrible position right now. He's thrown off the manifold, and he sort of slowly starts to make his way back to the manifold. He finally finds it and then slowly manages to climb his way up to the top of the manifold and then makes it finally. So during all that time that he was trying to get to the top of the manifold, he pretty much burned through all of his oxygen. So we get a really emotional scene where we get to see him during his last moments before all of his oxygen runs out, and he starts thinking about his fiancée and how he might not see her again. Now this is the part where I cried at. It was just super emotional to me because I think of all the workers who have very dangerous jobs like police, military, fire, who, they leave home every day and they're not sure if they're going to come back. So it was just a very touching scene, especially considering that in this scene we see Chris's face and it's like partially obstructed by all the bubbles and just his helmet in general, but you can still see and feel the pain on his face. Back on the ship, the crew are trying to figure out how they can regain control of everything. The captain and the first officer decide that they'll pilot the ship manually, and another one of the crew members tries to figure out a way to reboot all the computer systems in a much quicker way than originally intended. A few other members of the crew are utilizing this unmanned remote control watercraft that has a camera on it that allows them to, monitor the divers while they're working. It goes down to the manifold and we see Chris's almost lifeless body laying on top of the manifold as he's just clinging to life because he's not getting enough oxygen to his brain. Now on this watercraft, there's a set of mechanical pinchers that they can use to grab stuff and pull it up to the surface. They're thinking that maybe they could use it to pull Chris up to the surface, but it's kind of risky because it could damage his suit and make the problem worse. But they decide to try it anyways, and they do manage to grab a little clip on his suit and they begin pulling him up. Now unfortunately, Chris used a carabiner on his suit to clip himself into the manifold. It turns out that during a rescue mission where him and Duncan were searching for the bodies of these two people that got into a boating accident, they only found one of the bodies because the other body got swept away by the current. So Chris didn't want that to happen to him, so he clipped himself into the manifold. Chris's decision to clip himself onto the manifold obviously delays his rescue, but at the same time, it could have saved his life as well. So the crew member that I previously mentioned figures out a way to reboot all the systems, and now that the ship is able to return to Chris's location, Dave gets a green light to get back in the water and look for him. But before he goes, Duncan tells him, "I can't lose 2 divers today." He's basically saying, if you need to sacrifice Chris to save yourself, do it, because I can't lose 2 divers. Dave makes his way down. He finds Chris laying on the manifold. Then he unclips him from the manifold and then kind of just tethers him to his own suit. Now it's up to Dave to basically climb up his own umbilical cord back up to the bell, but because he's got a whole nother body with a heavy suit strapped into him, it makes it so much harder for him to make progress climbing up. He keeps sliding down the umbilical cord and can't keep a tight hold on it. The strategy that Duncan utilizes for Dave to use is that whenever the ship goes down a large wave, that's when Dave needs to start climbing because there's least resistance. And when it goes up a large wave, he just needs to hold on tight because that's when there's the most resistance. For several minutes, Dave is putting all of his strength and might into climbing this cord. Finally, he makes it back to the bell. Duncan pulls Chris up into the bell and makes multiple attempts to revive him. After Duncan gives Chris mouth to mouth for a little while, he finally begins breathing again. Dave makes his way back up into the bell and the 2 men start to talk to Chris. Now, even though Chris is conscious and he's breathing, his eyes are open, he's not responsive. Dave tries getting him to speak or move or clench his fists or anything, but it starts to become more and more clear that Chris suffered some pretty severe brain damage. However, Chris suddenly utters the name David and he becomes responsive. Turns out that he didn't have any brain damage at all after 29 minutes with no oxygen to his brain. That is absolutely miraculous. Not only did he suffer no brain damage, but he also suffered no long-term physical or mental damage from that incident. He went on to get married 7 months later, and then the 3 guys eventually came back to the work site to finish the job that they started. For a long time, I think 19 minutes was the longest anyone had ever gone without getting oxygen to their brain. I think most people just die within 9 to 10 minutes, but even if you do survive up to 19 minutes, you've got severe brain damage. But again, miraculously, Chris went on for 29 minutes and was completely fine, almost unfazed by it. He described blacking out as being almost peaceful, or he said not that bad. What's funny about all this is that at the end they give you a few more title cards saying that experts can't definitively explain why he was able to survive for so long without oxygen. I can give you an explanation. It's debatable how definitive it is, but it's an explanation. Anyways, Chris Lemons has said he's not religious, but to me that's God's work if I've ever seen it. One explanation that experts did speculate was that it was just a perfect combination of temperature and pressure on Chris's body that kind of kept his brain going, but at this point it's still a mystery, even 13 years later. So that was the movie Last Breath. I mean, it was such a good movie. I mean, this video is not really going to do it justice. You really got to go see it. First of all, it gives the audience a lot of perspective on what the diving industry is like. The production design is very high end for a based on a true story movie with such a low budget. The cinematographers, the editors, and the special effects artists all did a great job on this movie. The sound design was absolutely amazing. In combination with the production design, it conveyed this extreme, intense sense of intimidation and suspense when you're looking at the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean. And I think that's a feeling that's going to stick with me for a really long time after this movie. I will say the sound design is slightly overwhelming at certain points, but it wasn't anything like Hard Eyes, where it was just unnecessary and constantly overwhelming. It was justified, but slightly over the top at certain points. The soundtrack was also good. It wasn't anything memorable like Interstellar or anything like that, but it was definitely a good one. The best way I can describe this true story is one that was just meant to be showcased to audiences. There are some true stories that are like, they're good stories, they're emotional, they're inspiring, but they just don't really belong on the big screen. Like the movie Everest, for example. It was a good story, it was emotional, but it did not follow the traditional story structure. This story works very well in terms of the traditional story structure, especially considering how faithful it is to the actual events. And I mean, like I said before, from what I could gather, this movie is frame for frame of what actually happened back in 2012. But there are a couple of scenes, like when the movie does this fake out to make you think that Chris has severe brain damage, and then the scene where he tells his fiancée what happened, are both scenes that I struggle to believe would happen that way in real life. But I mean, that's just me speculating though. The scenes are still very good. One of the changes they did make to the story, or rather the characters, was their accents. In real life, all three guys were British, but in the movie, Woody Harrelson and Simu Liu just put on their American accents, which I think is good and bad. Good because Woody Harrelson with a British accent is weird, and bad because it just might take you out of the immersion a little bit and the actual events. But honestly, that's not even really that big of a deal. The only really big thing I would add to this movie is probably more character development. The characters don't really develop too much other than through this horrid situation that they're experiencing. There was one flashback in the movie, which I feel like if you're going to do one flashback, you might as well do three. Just follow that rule of thirds. I also would have liked to see more romantic development between Chris and his fiancée before the incident. The way they told it was very compelling, but I feel like that one scene that I told you guys I cried at, I feel like there could have been even more weight to that scene if we just had a little bit more romantic tension. All of those things I think would have just gotten us a little bit closer with the characters and lengthened our time with them, but there's really no other problems. There's absolutely no politics in this movie. It's just funny because all the fiction in Hollywood has so much politics injected into it. But then when you see these based on a true story movies, there's no politics at all. And it just exposes that scam. You're never going to see a sustainment diving contractor be like, oh, we need to get higher numbers with women. You're never going to see it. You're not going to see it here, and you're not going to see it in reality. The director, all the actors, awesome job. Compelling performances across the board. I think this movie especially demonstrates how often our society overlooks blue-collar workers in highly skilled jobs who put their lives at risk every day just so that someone across the world can have 3 days worth of warmth in their house. I'm personally a huge believer in the manufacturer being way more important than the writer and the artist. Alright, so for my final verdict, I will be ruling in favor of The Last Breath with 87%. That completely dethrones my previously highest rated movie, Companion, and it's not even close. We'll see how the rest of the year goes for Hollywood, but I have a feeling this is going to be my highest yet rated movie for a little while. Now, should you go see it? Should you rent it or stream it or just not watch it at all? I say go see it. Go see it on the big screen. It's definitely worth it. There's just something about the dark movie theater and the sound design with all the speakers around you that just really immerse you in this experience. I say it's worth the money and the drive. I think this is also the first time I'm recommending seeing a film on the big screen too. Okay, now I just really quickly want to talk about the movie The Monkey. It's terrible. The dialogue is terrible. Part of that is the acting, part of it is the writing, part of it is the cinematography and editing, and it just makes all the characters feel really inorganic. You know your movie is bad when the color grading is better than the cinematography in a horror film. 80 to 90% of the jokes just don't land. It's like trying to be relatable, but it just comes off as cringy most of the time. They throw a few subtle mocks at Christianity. And I mean, I see what they were trying to go for, but it was just completely disconnected from reality, and it did not read the room on this one. And then just some of the dialogue just makes zero sense and is completely unnecessary. Oh my gosh, the scares in this movie are ridiculous too. It was a lot like Hard Eyes, where a handful of the jump scares were just completely unnecessary. But while Hard Eyes actually caught you off guard and made you jump a little bit, this movie is just not scary at all, ever. The kills in this movie are so over the top that they're not even just like a bit of a stretch. It's like even young children would understand that some of the kills in this movie would never happen in real life the way they did in the movie. A lot of it just relies on the audience giving the movie the benefit of the doubt. Speaking of which, there's a lot of occurrences that sort of just like retcon the setup of the movie and are just unjustified in the moment. And I know someone's going to say, well, there was a plot twist. But the problem with that is that there was no foreshadowing for that plot twist. There was zero foreshadowing. You can't even really say it was subtle foreshadowing because I didn't see it. There was no foreshadowing for it. The characters just kind of ignored it. And then when the plot twist came, the characters were like, oh yeah, that happened. And this is why. It was just completely messed up. There's plenty of convenient writing. The pacing of the story is terrible, and thus the characters and the plot feel so disconnected from the actual premise of the story. The conflict that they set up is just really cringy. And by the end, it does not get the hang time it needs to sell the ending. Speaking of endings, this movie had none. The climax that they went for was just completely half-assed and totally underwhelming, just to be generous. There's this like not so shocking shock value moment at the very end, and it just completely undermines the dialogue that happened just seconds prior. The worst part about this too is they like completely ignore the monkey throughout the movie. Like the way they set it up is cool, like because the monkey like teleports and stuff, so they have to like find it, but then they ruin that. I mean, really, the only three words I could use to describe this movie is unscary, uncreative, and just completely uncompelling. The only good things about this movie is one, half of the production design is alright, which is really hard to mess up, even though they somehow managed to mess up half of it. And also, the characters do develop a little bit, but other than that, this movie is just pain. If this is anything like the Stephen King short story that this movie is adapting, that's just sad. It's the same director of the movie Longlegs, Oz Perkins, which was an okay movie despite, again, some of the dialogue, some of the narrative choices, and then the cinematography. But I have never been so disappointed by a movie that I actually had low expectations for. So you guys already know how I feel about horror comedies, but setting that aside as usual, for my final verdict, I will be ruling against the movie The Monkey at 20%, which will dethrone Hard Eyes as my lowest rated movie yet. And I think it'll also be the first time I suggest never watching a movie. It was a huge waste of my time. It would be a huge waste of your time. I could have spent that time working on my Last Breath review. It is absolutely astonishing to me that Rotten Tomatoes has this movie at fucking 79%. If I put all my personal yet fair biases aside, I would maybe rate this movie at like 40% if I'm feeling generous. And I mean, I actually used to get really excited for James Wan movies. I didn't care too much for the Insidious movies, but I loved the Conjuring movies. But now, this one just really makes me cautious about his future movies. Anyways, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this review, please take a quick moment to hit the like and subscribe button. We've got the Oscars coming up next week, so I'm thinking of doing like a breakdown of all the winners. But anyways, that's all for this case. This court's adjourned.